jazz with me. No, I really appreciate coming, being on time for the first talk of the day. I know how big of a deal that is. Before we begin, I just want to apologize. I'm on that cough drop game right now. So if my voice cracks, I am an adult. I'm not going through puberty. I'm just having a rough time in my vocal cords. Quick question, who here was at my talk? I gave a talk yesterday during Dev Day, Narrative Cake. Did anyone come to that? Cool, all right, so the jokes will be new for the other half of you. Awesome, sorry for anyone else. Let's get started. A little bit about who I am before we begin. My name is Brad Plaxen. I am a narrative designer at People Can Fly Studios in New York. I'm also a playwright. I do some screenwriting. I'm an engineer, maybe. Technically I code, but I don't do much of that. If you really want to ask me coding questions, see me afterwards. So what are we doing this? Oh. Why is it not going to the next slide? There we go. What are we doing today? What am I going to be doing today? I'm here to throw some shade at some bad branching narrative. Nothing says 10:02 a.m. like trash talk. No, that's not really what we're doing. We're going to break down the components of good and bad branching dialogue design by looking at some sort of examples of games that have come out and done this sort of thing in the commercial space primarily. Why are we doing this? Why is this important? The branching dialogue of a game is a window into how the designers view the meaning of human interaction. That was me just now. I made that up. I truly believe that the way that the branching dialogue of a game is designed tells you a lot about what the designers value and simultaneously can make for good or bad branching dialogue. I'm sure there are many people here. If you're here, you're probably interested in branching dialogue, but I'm sure everyone has that one friend who's like, I hate branching dialogue, that's not a real game, it's a multiple choice quiz. Well, if you're interested in designing branching dialogue that isn't like that, great, this will help. And if you're just interested in the sort of values that branching dialogue, awesome, this talk will also dive into some of that. So, without further ado, we're going to be talking about these 7 components of branching dialogue. These are not the only 7 ways to break down branching dialogue, but the ones we're going to talk about this morning. So they are dialogue, the actual words of the characters that they say, presentation of the options, inclusion, obligation, timing, progression, and objective. And don't worry if you don't have this written down right now. Believe me, these are going to come up 1,000 more times. The way this talk is sort of structured is from the bottom up, dialogue being the most micro element of a branching conversation. It's literally the word for word of it, all the way up to objective, which is sort of this global concept for the whole game. So let's break these down, the good, the bad, the weird. Fair warning, little bit of content warning, nothing too risque. I think there's a few curse words in some of the videos that we're going to be showing, as well as 1 or 2 other ones that I'll throw up a flag ahead of time, but it's nothing too terrible. I don't think anyone here is too young to be hearing this. So let's start, dialogue. Dialogue is, like I said, the words a character says, and also what words are important. So it's not just how the sentence is structured, but how the game values the actual words being spoken. And the first example we're going to look at of a really good example of dialogue being done in a game is in the game Firewatch. Firewatch is a game in which you play as a Firewatch in a national park, forming a relationship with one of the other Firewatches as a mystery unfolds in the woods. So let's take a look at this clip from the game. And I want you to pay attention specifically to how the words are spoken, as well as what the deeper meaning of each choice is.
got a front row seat for what might be the biggest fire of the year.
Yeah, it's really going.
I'm gonna call it in. They'll send in a hotshot crew for some suppression, but I bet we'll be stuck with her for the rest of the summer. And she doesn't have a name yet. I usually think of something funny or something practical or a little risque when coming up with them. But why don't you do the honors? So, no ideas, huh?
Maybe we call it the Flapjack Fire. Can you sell that as a name?
You really like that, huh?
Yeah, I said I did. It's funny.
Fair enough. Flapjack Fire it is. They'll probably ask me if it was a camp cooking accident or something.
Okay, so in that clip, you get to name this fire, which is present throughout the rest of the game. And what's really notable about that is that dialogue choice ends up serving multiple different functions as you go on. For context, the character you're playing as has a sick wife at home, and you are forming a complicated romance with the person on the other end of that walkie-talkie. If you noticed, the third dialogue choice was to name the fire Delilah. Well, that's the name of the person you are speaking to. So not only is that serving a story function of the game actually remembering the choice you make, which feels really nice when you're picking dialogue, but additionally, there's a subtextual level about the romantic relationship. So that's a really good example of the game designers showing their value system there. They value this relationship. They value those complicated emotional choices. So let's look at some NPC dialogue from the game Oblivion, which if you YouTube NPC dialogue Oblivion, there's a lot of stuff on YouTube about it. This is not a branching dialogue for context, but I thought it was a good example of dialogue in general.
I understand the Fighters Guild is hiring new members. Not bad work for some folks.
I see. Bye.
Take care. Greetings.
Sometimes I just go look at the great oak. Magnificent, don't you think?
I've heard others say the same.
Anyone looking for work should consider the Fighters Guild.
The thing he
I
just
hear
said.
they're always looking for recruits.
I hear you.
Heard any news from the other provinces?
Nothing I'd like to talk about.
Take care.
Well met.
Okay, great. They just had 3 conversations, each one 2 sentences long. Okay, so yes, this is kind of broken and it's easy to pick on, which does speak to the priorities of the game developers. But cut them some slack on that. Time, budget, scope. These are all understandable things that maybe weren't prioritized by production or publishers or deadlines. It's fine. But also on a deeper level, this isn't how people talk. Like, regardless of the sort of weird tech bugginess of that, the actual lines themselves don't indicate any sort of multiple layers to them at all. There's no intent behind the words, so the designers make NPCs an unserious thing and the players don't take them seriously. So comparing the two, Firewatch has memory, multi-layered meaning, emotional stakes. In Oblivion, there's no memory, it's flat, and the NPCs are mechanical vessels. So for presentation, a presentation is how the dialogue choices are presented to the player. So this is actually the visual layout of the choices. A great example of this is a dating game called Lady Killer in a Bind. And in this game, it's a dating sim, you're on a boat. Details of it are not important. What's important to note here is how this game is demonstrating dialogue choices. For those of you who might not be able to see because the text is a little small, in each of those 3 choices, they have the beginning of the actual phrase you're going to say, as well as on the left, descriptions for the tone in which you are saying it. Tone is one of the hardest things when doing a dialogue choice to communicate because the same words have very different meaning. I'm sure everyone's heard the thing about 90% of human speech is nonverbal and that sort of thing. Well, it's a great way to say, if you're making this choice, You can make it based on the words or the intent of the motivation. So the presentation here is really clear. Notice on the right side, you'll see these little unlock things. That's also gameplay mechanics of the dialogue choices being presented. This is a great example. This is a screenshot from the game L.A. Noire, which if you can't see the choices on the top left, well, that's the first problem. But the three choices you have when you are interrogating witnesses in this noir drama are truth, doubt, and lie. And here's why that's significant. First of all, if I said you get to respond to someone with truth, doubt, or lie, I have no idea what that means. Am I telling the truth? Am I telling a lie? Do I think they're telling the truth? It's wildly unclear, and this is consistent throughout every single conversation in the game, regardless of whether or not it actually tracks with the last thing that the NPC said. They made the choice to have every single dialogue option in this part of the game be truth, doubt, and lie. Now, it probably wouldn't surprise you to find out that originally it was coax, force, and accuse, all three of those being verbs, which is great. There's better consistency. I don't know why they changed it. I still think it's a little inflexible, but at least they are consistent internally. Good thing is they fixed this for the re-release into good cop, bad cop, and accuse. The first thing you'll note is they made the text way bigger. Good. I still don't think these are perfect. I think these are maybe better because at least you understand when you're making the third option, you are accusing them of something, and the other two give you a little more sense of tone. Still not perfect. So comparing them, Lady Killer in a Bind, you have clear intent, it adapts to situations, you have these predictable outcomes, you know what you're picking. Whereas in L.A. Noire, these vague meanings seem like a design choice made really early on that they couldn't escape from once they had recorded the dialogue. Okay, looking to our third component, we have inclusion. Now, inclusion is which choices are presented and which choices are omitted. The key here is that this is not about what you have to pick, this is what they even give you as options in the first place. A great example of a game giving you an inclusive choice that reveals the values of the designers is in the game Mass Effect. Mass Effect is a role-playing game where it's a sci-fi adventure role-playing game with a lot of romantic threads in the game. And one thing they do really nicely is have the player able to back out of a relationship. And here's an example of what that kind of looks like.
Hey,
We need to discuss our relationship.
I said I want to think about everything. You know what it's like to think you're alone and find out you're not?
Pretty much, yeah.
You don't have to agree so fast, you fucker.
This is getting tiresome, Jack. I thought you weren't the thinking type.
What are you getting at, Shepard? Don't 180 on me.
I've got other options. You understand, right?
Right. I said I didn't care where you played. That's your call. Your ship. Don't need you in my head anyway.
Okay, so he's kind of a jerk, but that was not the example for dialogue. That was the example of inclusion. What I really like about that is that a lot of games, once you start down a path in a romantic relationship, they sort of assume that you want to continue pursuing that. And I think when creating media, you're saying a lot about your values, about relationships, consent, partnership, and I think including the option to 180, like the other character says, is actually a great thing if it makes sense for your game. Here's a really, really bad example of inclusion. In the game, Leisure Suit Larry, Wet Dreams Don't Dry. Yeah, so I hear yikes. You got it. Leisure Suit Larry is a series of games notorious for putting you in the shoes of Larry, who is on the hunt to have sex. And this is a scene from early on in a game where he is transported into the year 2018 and has to deal with politically correct millennial culture, with a lot of air quotes around that. And so here's a small clip of him setting up it's essentially Tinder profile in that game. And I want you to think about the way they give you the options for choices. Oh. The slideshow doesn't even want me to show you this clip. What? Hold on.
Thing. Of course, we'll give you all the hottest tips, and you'll get more tail than you can tap in a lifetime.
Just leave a few for us too.
Yeah, just give me your pie phone. Here.
You change one single thing in my settings, and I will hack your own pie phone and publish your browser history.
Okay. So in order for me to set up the perfect profile for you, I need you to answer a few questions.
Sure.
Name?
Larry Laffer.
Nickname?
Lounge lizard.
That's what they called me in elementary school.
Profession?
Guy who understands women.
I'll just enter IT specialist. Chicks love that.
Yeah, that's why they're always after us too.
Okay, I think we're
what's
done
your
here.
motto? Your tagline?
All right. So, hold on. I'm trying to make this full screen now. This is what I get for. So, is that not going to go full screen? Sorry, 1 second.
This bad game just destroyed your whole...
I know. Okay, there we go. We're not going to go full screen again. Okay, so in that clip right there, you can see that they give you a huge number of choices that are all essentially the same flavor of a bad sex joke. And what's actually the most frustrating part about this to me is the characters never say these choices out loud. You could have typed in anything you wanted, and they, in fact, at other places in this game, have the ability to type things in. So if you want to talk about inclusive choices, player creativity in a game that's all about humor, there's no reason why they didn't just let you type these things in, store that text in the game, and then whenever you look at your Tinder profile, pull up the actual thing you typed. And then, depending on how crass and crude your own sense of humor is, that's what the game is for you. Wildly frustrating. We're going to move on. We spent way too much time on Leisure Suit Larry. Exclusion is another way to show values related to inclusion. In the dating sim Dream Daddy, there is a dad that no matter what you do, you're dating a bunch of dads, that's all you need to know. There's a dad that no matter what you do, you cannot actually have a successful, happy ending with. The designers in that moment are communicating their values here. Dating is an agreement between two people, and sometimes no matter what you say, it doesn't work out. So just like including diverse sets of options is a way to express your values, exclusion is another way. And then this is just a funny example. In the game The Witcher 3, there's a point where you can say, reading my mind, or really hate it when you read my mind. That's not including. That's not even branching dialogue. That's practically the same thing. So think about how different your choices are. Obligation, the fourth thing. when a player must speak and what they must say when they speak. So a great example of obligation being done really well is in the game Oxenfree. Oxenfree is a game where you go on a camping trip, you play as a high school girl, and you go on a camping trip with some friends, and you're going through a rough time in your life. And this game has a really interesting branching dialogue system where you can interrupt at certain times, but additionally, you can choose to say nothing at all. And what's really great about that is that considering the character is going through a hard time, maybe you don't want to respond to certain questions. That's realistic. In the real world, sometimes you don't want to talk. You don't want to respond to something. You don't think something justifies that, especially when, like this character, you're going through a hard time. The freedom to remain silent is a value that the designers injected into this game. If you want to see just a really different way of of interruptions and things, highly recommend checking out this game. Here's another game where silence is always an option in the Batman Telltale series. It's a game where you play as Batman going on a comic book adventure. So silence is always an option in a game. You see they have the 3 dots there, and also you can just wait for a timer to go out. And unlike Oxenfree, where it feels aligned with the character's motivations, here it makes no sense. There will be characters holding guns to your head and be like, well, what do you think about that? Say something. And then you don't, and then they kill you. That's a real thing that happens multiple times in this game. Harley Quinn can kill you if you don't say anything. I think the Riddler can kill you if you don't say anything. I understand that Telltale has a sort of structure that they're known for, but in this specific case, they're valuing player autonomy over actual role-playing in a game where you're role-playing as Batman. That's the whole point of people picking up this game. And I think that the choice for silence here ends up betraying that role-playing. So comparing these two, silence in Oxenfree is a choice aligned with its themes, where silence in the Batman game is actually fighting against the feeling you want players to have. Timing. So this is how the dialogue choices are presented to, this is how long you have to make the choices when you're presented with branching dialogue. So this is whether you can hang out in that screen and analyze your thoughts, or if you have some sort of timer, as well as when the choices pop up on the screen. Is it before you're expected to speak or after the other player has finished, or the NPC has finished speaking? One thing to note about that, which is not necessarily in the examples I have, that's a great place to show your value of listening in your game. If you present speaking choices before the other person has finished talking, you are saying that you no longer have to listen to the rest of what they have to say. Now, if you design your dialogue for that to make sense, great. But otherwise, you're actually subverting your own goals of having your dialogue heard. If anybody's been in a conversation where they feel like the other person already knows what they want to say before you finish talking, you know it's very frustrating. Just ask my girlfriend. I do that all the time. She lets me know. Here's a great example of timing being done really well in the game Heavy Rain. In this scene, you're being interrogated
Please tell him what
It
happened.
was this
son.
afternoon. I went to the park with my son, Sean. We played together for a while, and then he wanted to go on the carousel, so I put him on one of the wooden horses, and when I turned back, Sean had disappeared.
Exactly what time did you arrive at the park? Try to remember exactly, Mr. Mars. Every detail can be important.
It must have been about 4:15. Yeah, that's it, 4:15. I remember exactly because I looked at the clock in the park when we arrived.
What was your son wearing when he disappeared?
He was wearing a coat. A beige coat. And a pair of pants. Green pants.
Okay, so what I really like about that with timing, as well as the sort of shaking element, is that it adds tension. When you are watching it, it's a little jarring, but when you're actually playing it, there's a moment of genuine kind of panic when you are asked those questions because you're aware that you might be a suspect as this kid's father. This game doesn't let you hang out and think about it and pull up your phone and Google the screenshot from the scene prior when your kid was kidnapped to find out the answers to those questions. And what this ends up doing is making it so that sometimes you don't say what you meant to say. You remember right after clicking the button, no, it wasn't 4:15, it was 4:30. I remember what the clock looked like now. And that's true to real life, especially when people are under pressure. And that's revealing that the designers had considered that part of, stressful situations. Truthfully, I couldn't find a good example of bad timing. Most games consider this as one of their earliest design decisions, but I will sort of describe an example. If you've ever been in a game where there is a very stressful situation, somebody has a weapon, or somebody asks you something really personal, and you can take as much time as you need to do that decision. You can put the controller down, go to the kitchen, grab a snack, come back. That's bad timing, and it breaks the immersion. Progression. This is the sixth of the components of branching dialogue. Progression is how you continue through a conversation. It is the locks and keys for successful and unsuccessful progression. Sometimes in a game, you have to select every option. You have 3 questions, you're going to go down each path, and you're always going to come back and have the opportunity. Other times, options close. Again, thinking back to the timing of does something show up before the other person is finished talking, for progression, when you have every option available and it's just a matter of the order they are selected in, you're saying something very different about human conversation. You're saying that it doesn't matter which one you say first, as long as you get to say it all. Whereas when you limit it, there's a lot more pressure into the actual choices you make. A great example of progression and making that very clear to the player is in the game Subsurface Circular. It's a robot detective game. And for this clip, I want you specifically to pay attention to what's happening on the right side of the screen as this conversation is playing out. So notice the new objective and new focus point. So what's great about this game in terms of progression is that being a detective game, they are valuing facts, information, and motivation. That's aligned with the themes of the game and the type of story that the designers are trying to make. As a result, the types of decision metrics you have, the goals you're trying to achieve within a conversation are clearly laid out the way a detective might think about things. That focal point, oh, they said something interesting. That objective, this is the next clue I need to hunt down. Great example of how progression is clear to a player. Now, progression can also be emotionally driven and doesn't need to be so explicitly lock and key. Maybe you need to get somebody to trust you, and that trust can be achieved in a lot of different ways. By telling them something personal, by empathizing with them. It doesn't need to be so explicitly a clue hunt in the way that this game is. A game that actually, for the most part, does this really well is Life is Strange. A game in which you are a high schooler who suddenly gets the power to travel back in time and has to figure out where that power came from while mending the relationship with an old friend. In this sequence, not a video, but just a little bit of content, there is a suicide scene in this game where one of the other characters in the game is standing on a rooftop. And you have to try to talk her down from the rooftop. And the majority of the choices for the beginning of this conversation are emotionally driven, like I was describing before. It's about empathy, it's about listening, and that's what a lot of the game is about. And then suddenly they give you this choice where she says, nobody cares about me, and you have to randomly pick one of her family members to say they care about her. Now, the only way you would possibly know which one of these to pick is if when you went into that character's room earlier in the game, you had found the right object in the room, which was a letter from her dad saying how much she cared about her. It's super easy to miss. And in a game that otherwise does not emphasize finding every little nook and cranny and clue hunting the way that the previous game, Subsurface Circular, does, this feels wildly unfair. And to do that at a moment of such high tension, I know at least I felt betrayed while playing the game. Because otherwise, that game is pretty solidly designed in terms of that emotional, empathetic half of conversation. So comparing these two, Subsurface Circular is a game with a consistent setup that defines the rules for social interaction within the universe, and those rules are specifically aligned with the themes that the designers wanted to convey. Life is Strange feels like at this moment it tricks the players and subverts its own value system. Another place where this goes horribly wrong are in a lot of dating sims. I just wrote many dating sims. Where you have these interactions where, if you see on the bottom, her affection level will change according to your choices. Treating relationships like Subsurface Circular does as a clue hunting, there's a right way and a wrong way, where as long as you say the right things, you will succeed, is toxic at best. And I don't think I need to go into more details about why treating romantic relationships transactionally is not a value that you probably intend to show as a designer. The last one we're going to talk about is objective. Objective is why you enter a conversation. What is your goal in general? A really great example of this is the game Detroit Become Human. Not necessarily every part of the game, but especially this beginning part of the game. This is the opening scene. Detroit Become Human takes place in a sci-fi futuristic robot America where you play as a bunch of androids. And the opening scene is a hostage situation where you are trying to talk down another android who has kidnapped a human girl. This scene makes perfect sense in the game. You don't want to react with violence or aggression. You are a negotiator. And here you are trying to save this human, which is directly tied into the themes of the game of what is an android, what is a human, these very common sci-fi themes. This conversation makes perfect sense. On the other hand, Fallout New Vegas has this speech stat that you can have as a player. It's a role-playing game that takes place in a post-apocalyptic future where there are certain encounters, like the one on the screen, where if you just have your speech stat high enough, you can talk somebody out of a confrontation. That sounds fine until you remember that by this point in the game, you've already killed hundreds and hundreds of people with no remorse. Why in any world were you going to go, you know, this is the person, this bad person is the one I'm going to talk down? It doesn't make sense. You're already a psychopath. In fact, don't think about that too hard, because when you think about the fact that a lot of games have cutscenes where you're crying over a single death after slaughtering thousands, video games as a whole, medium breakdown. Don't do that to yourself. Don't think about it too hard. But this is an example of your objective making kind of no sense for dialogue to be the solution here. So comparing these two, in Detroit Become Human, dialogue, initiation, starting that conversation aligns with your values. And the circumstances around it convey the themes of the game. This is great. In Fallout New Vegas, they seem adjacent as an added mechanic because role-playing games are supposed to have that. Objectives, going back to the dating sims thing, can often go off the rails here if your motivation in the game is strictly sexual. A game built around trying to convince and or trick people into having sex with you, again, the morals there are dubious at best. However, there are other options for those of you here who are interested in dating games. This is a game, Monster Prom, which is wildly fun, and you can play multiplayer couch co-op. Highly recommend. And the goal in this game is to get a prom date. How awesome, how fun. How much more stressful was getting a prom date than anything else, any other social interaction you've ever done your whole life. This game's great, and I think there are ways to do dating sims with objectives that are still high stakes and exciting without being explicitly sex. This is a great example of that. So, going back through the components of branching dialogue, if you missed any of them, here they are. All of these are together the components that allow a designer to convey their values. It's not just the fact that the characters say a certain thing or do a certain thing. The game mechanics themselves actually convey those values. Brief case study. I used to work for a company called Kognito, mandatory acknowledgement, not here as a representative, so if they ever see this video, I'm not speaking on their behalf. In Kognito games, we were making games that were branching dialogue games for educational purposes related to health and social awareness. So they were supposed to teach people how to engage in conversations about difficult topics such as addiction, depression, trauma, etc. And each time we designed a product for a client, we would approach the conversations using the 7 parameters I talked about. If not explicitly, because we did have a platform that had some of these things locked in, implicitly in the ways that we would revise and iterate on the conversations. So when we were writing dialogue, we would consider word choice that reflected correct terminology for that situation. So if we're making a conversation to teach teachers how to talk to students who've been through trauma, we might put these 2 options on the screen. I think you were more nervous than the other students. Why? And you have straight A's in the class. Why are you so nervous? The subtle differences between those 2 choices, the implication of fault in the second one, why are you so nervous, the dismissiveness of that, versus the objectiveness and openness of why, is something that was part of our teaching goals and how we always looked at every single piece of dialogue we wrote. In terms of presentation, we would group things based on a diverse set of tactics which adapted to the reinforced learning opportunities. So we didn't just have truth, doubt, and lie. We would change them based on the circumstances. And what it allowed us to do for learning goals was, even if you wouldn't say the exact phrasing that was within that tactic, you could see that that's the idea of the type of thing I would say. And if I were doing this in real life, I would find my own phrasing for that. For inclusion, we would always include bad choices as within good tactics as well. This indicated that just because you think you're doing one thing doesn't mean you're actually doing that thing when you say those words out loud. If anyone's ever been in a tough conversation where someone goes, well, hey, cheer up. You know how frustrating it can be when someone's trying to do the right thing but not being thoughtful about the words that they're using to express that. Obligation was one we didn't really think about. The games are all branching dialogue, so you can't not be in the conversation. In terms of timing, we had no time limit on these games. These games weren't about winning or losing. They were about the values that we were trying to teach players. So there wasn't any timing. You could take as long as you wanted to read all of the choices. In fact, we even had an undo button so that if you made a choice and you said, you know what, I want to try something different, you could go back in time and do that other option. In terms of progression, there were usually multiple ways to succeed because we're trying to mimic real life there. In real life, there is not usually a single magic phrase that will make someone feel better, especially when they are going through trauma, stress, those sorts of topics that we often covered in our games. So really, the game was about listening more than speaking. You could get to the end saying a lot of wrong things, which is kind of the point. Don't be afraid to engage someone in a meaningful conversation because you're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And that was something that was really important in the way we designed progression. And lastly, the objective of the game, every conversation was very clearly defined by the situation and the client we were working with. So, okay, what's the takeaway? Why did we go through these 7 things? Like I said at the beginning, these will help you design better games, find better games to play. If you're interested in playing games, look at the way that they do their dialogue. It'll tell you a lot about how the rest of the game probably plays. But really at the end, just be thoughtful. That's really the key. If you're a designer in the room, be thoughtful about the ways that you are writing your dialogue. It's not a break from gameplay, it is gameplay. And it should be treated with the same level of thoughtfulness as the rest of your mechanics in terms of your values. And don't just add branching dialogue because your aging franchise is out of ideas that actually improve the game. Whoa, I said there was gonna be shade thrown. We did it, we threw shade. Okay. I'm sure those games are fine. I haven't played either one. Questions? We have about 3 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions about any of these 7 things or dialogue and stuff in games in general? Yeah.
Going back to the Fallout New Vegas option, or example you had, I was wondering if you could talk about the part where you have to have a certain stat boost of 30 in order to unlock certain dialogue choices, and if you find anything problematic with that.
So my issue with that, so for anyone who didn't hear, in that game you have that stat which unlocks different dialogue options when you have conversations. It's your speaking stat, or I think they call it speaking, a speech. My issue with that is actually not that you have skills that unlock dialogue choices. That's fine. What I don't like about that is that it's one skill, which is just you good at talking or you bad at talking. And I think a much more, again, thoughtful way to do that, which, again, I don't know the constraints of that team. I like, by the way, just side note, I like a lot of the games that were my bad examples. This is not a slight at those games in terms of what they achieved and their success. Just a side note, also, anyone from those teams we're watching? I really do like a lot of those games. That's why I picked them. But yeah, I think a much more thoughtful way of designing that would have been something like have empathy as a skill, have coercion as a skill, break down whatever your values are as a designer, break those down into, it doesn't even need to be a lot, 2, 3, 4 skills. And then the role-playing actually kind of makes more sense too. There's a lot of tabletop RPGs that do this really well. So if you're looking at, especially how skills affect dialogue, look at the world of tabletop role-playing. I think we have time for one more question if anyone has one. Otherwise, thank you. Okay, thank you everybody.